and like, I don't know, seeing ghosts and maybe meeting, extraterrestrials or whatever. As remarkable as those things appear to our human consciousness, we need to remember that there's something far more substantial behind all of those phenomena, and we ourselves are merely one expression of phenomena.
Welcome to Buddha at the Gas Pump. My name is Rick Archer. Buddha at the Gas Pump is a long-running, this is our 16th season, series of interviews with spiritually awakening people. This program is made possible through the support of appreciative listeners and viewers. So if you appreciate it and would like to help support it, there are PayPal buttons on every page of the site. And speaking of the site, it is batgap.com, BATGAP. And if you're just watching this on YouTube or listening to the audio podcast, you might want to check it out because there are things there that you won't find on YouTube. My guest today is Jim Grove. Jim is a lifelong practitioner of yogic meditation who grew up in a small logging town on the west coast of Canada. At age 13, he was introduced to a teacher who was one of the few ministers directly ordained by Paramahansa Yogananda during his lifetime. That was his mother, Yogacharya M. Hamilton of Seattle. A series of early transcendental experiences convinced him to commit himself to continued yogic practice under her tutelage. His recent memoir, A Curious Spiritual Journey, recounts some of the prominent experiences that have arisen from his practice over 4 decades, starting from early adolescence. He likes to speak plainly about spiritual experience and practice, avoiding the vague, abstract, and sometimes inflated language used in much spiritual and New Age writing. That's what I gathered from your book. I mean, the subtitle of this interview is Conversations with Ordinary Spiritually Awakening People. And the reason we chose that, and the reason that was a motivation for starting this show, is that many people have a fantastical notion of what awakening or spiritual development might be, and therefore they could have actually been spiritual practitioners for quite some time, but feel like the hope of them ever attaining anything significant is rather slim because they're not yet able to float 2 feet off the ground and they don't glow in the dark. So one of my motivations in starting this was to interview people, ordinary spiritually awakening people, so people could see that people like them were, having some significant breakthroughs. And, you really made that part of your practice in a way. You said in your book and in your life, hey, I want to just be a regular guy and work on my spiritual development, but I'm still going to go out drinking with my buddies and do this and do that and be a normal human being in addition to being, a spiritual aspirant. And, obviously those types of things can be taken to extremes. And once in a while, you probably indulged in them more than you were happy to have done the next morning.
Yes.
But you've nonetheless continued to have profound breakthroughs and experiential realizations as you've gone along.
Yeah. So thanks for that synopsis. That's I feel like you articulated it better than I would have likely.
Oh, I don't know. You've got a better education than I do, and have been a professional writer at times. So the book was very readable. It was real entertaining. Sometimes I read or listen to spiritual books and I get a little bored, but yours really held my interest.
Oh, great. Well, there a lot of effort went into that in terms of editing. It's for anyone out there who's interested in writing. The original manuscript was about 80,000 words because there was a lot of stuff I had in there, and I just came back and I mercilessly edited and took stuff out, that I felt wasn't necessarily sort of contributing to the sort of central thesis, narrative of things that there were little things that maybe they delighted me personally, but they didn't necessarily contribute to a story that would help anyone that was reading it. So the manuscript went from about 80,000 words down to 55,000 words.
Yeah, Mark Twain once said to somebody, "I'm sorry to have sent you such a long letter. I was too busy to write a short one."
Yes. Yeah, no, that's big inspiration for me. Him and I dare say Hemingway. I know Hemingway gets a bad rap.
His stuff was really pithy. I mean, he could spend a whole afternoon on a paragraph.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Jim, shall we do this somewhat chronologically? You mentioned that you first got bitten by the spiritual bug when you were 13. How did that happen?
Well, yeah, it's interesting. I would say that I had a good grounding, and as I explain in the book, I had a good grounding prior to that in the Anglican Church of Canada, which is the equivalent in Canada of the Episcopalian Church in the United States.
So, kind of
And
liberal, kind of open-minded, a little bit.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and there's such a thing as high Anglican, which is almost like the Catholic Church, and then there's low Anglican. And the little country parish that I went to was very much low Anglican. It's it's of the people for the people.
Kind of
And
Unitarian-ish.
yeah,
Yeah.
and but I've always been really grateful for that grounding that I had. And
Hmm.
the way I put it is, at age 12, of my own recognizance, as is the tradition within the church, you are, encouraged to take First Communion, which is, you taking up the mantle, from baptism. Your parents baptized you and said they'd raise you in the Christian church, and then at age 12, you say, "Yeah, I hereby take up the mantle, and I'm going to continue in the faith." And I did that, and I was very enthused about it. And that was coming from me; it wasn't coming from my parents. And within a year, though, I was already starting to find that I was getting, I don't know, there was something that was missing for me. I always had we can say a sensibility or a sensitivity to that stillness, that sense of presence, that sense of something bigger. And the church wasn't quite touching that for me, with its in terms of the weekly sermons and what have you. And then my brother Peter came to visit. He's 15 years older than me. So at this time, he would have been like 27. And he started talking about this teacher that him and his wife had met in Seattle, Mother Yogacharya Hamilton. And I got interested. And at that point, I had no idea what a guru was.
Hmm.
He used the word guru, and that sort of was confusing to me. But I paid attention and I listened to understand. And then, as he described what she was about and some of the things she was teaching, um, something lit up for me. Anyways, like some part of me knew that this is interesting to me. And he said, as it happened to be, that she was visiting Victoria the following week to give a lecture, and that she frequently came up to Victoria. She had a group there, a center in Victoria. So I went, and it was pretty much, well, it was an aha kind of moment listening to her speak, and then meeting her afterwards and talking with her. There was no, I mean, looking back now, I can say in hindsight that what I was feeling was very much her aura, her energy field, and it was incredibly powerful. I couldn't possibly say enough about that.
Right.
But
And she had been a contemporary of Yogananda.
she was one of his original disciples. So
Mm.
Yogananda first traveled in the United States in 1925.
Right.
And in on his grand tour, he stopped in Seattle, and my guru met him. She was 21 years old. She went to
Mm.
see him speak, and same kind of thing. She was immediately converted, as it were, and became his disciple. And within, I don't know, within about 15, 20 years, she had become a leader, like a center leader in Seattle. And then subsequent to that, shortly prior to his death in 1952, he gave her the title of Yogacharya, which means master of yoga. And and she was one of, like I mentioned in the book, I think one of the 14 or so that he ordained during his lifetime.
Mm.
But more than that, she was actually one of the first like five or six,
Yeah.
people in his ministry. So I feel like, imagine it, I feel very, very privileged to have been able to have her as my teacher.
Yeah. And she was quite remarkable. I mean, I don't know whether you want to mention anything now or it'll come out during the rest of this interview, but there were a number of occasions where she, um, could clearly read what you were thinking
Oh
and
yeah.
things like that without making a show about it.
Yeah, there was never any show. There was never any flash. And that's something that I really liked about her. And that may come from the fact that she herself was born in Duluth. I think she was from. I know she was from Minnesota. I think she was from Duluth
Uh,
originally, and came from a, a working class, very much a working class family.
yeah.
And yeah,
Yeah, there was a funny story where you and your brother, went down to see her from Victoria down to Seattle, and she was getting pretty old at this point, and you wanted to take her out to lunch, but you didn't have any money, and you couldn't certainly afford it at a very expensive place, and you didn't think she would want to eat at a place like Denny's, and then she's somehow or other she says, let's go to Denny's, so you all go to Denny's, and she buys you lunch, I think the story went, but there were some
oh
other
yeah,
things too where she would pick up on some thought you had, and without again being a show off about it, but just make it very clear to me that she understood what you were thinking, and could respond accordingly.
yes, yeah. And I would like to add that particularly that on that occasion when we went to Seattle, and my brother and I were driving to her apartment, and we were aware that it was a Sunday, and at that time we couldn't get any American currency. And we thought, well, what are we going to do? You're supposed to honor the guru by taking them out for a nice meal or doing something for them. And the one thing we knew is that Denny's in the United States at that time, anyways, would accept Canadian currency.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
And so we said, well, we looked at each other as we're driving along. We went, well, maybe we can take her to Denny's. And we both started laughing, like, yeah, right. Like, that's never going to happen. And
Yeah.
in this junky old car that we were driving with my mother's, this really beat up car. And we just felt like the most disheveled devotees in history, and but we brushed all that off, and when we got there, and and we sit down in the living room, we start chit chatting, and and she, being polite and just asking us how we're doing, whatnot, and then I want to say that she was toying with us. It was, she was playing with us a bit, and she just looked at, she just went quiet for a minute, and then she looked at us each in turn and said, "Have you guys eaten lunch yet?" And she just let it hang, the
Yeah.
question hang for a minute, and Peter and I look at each other and go, no." And she says, "What do you say we go to Denny's? I'll buy."
That's great. Nice.
Yeah. But she was like that. I'd like to emphasize that she had such a great sense of humor, you
Yeah.
know. But at the same time, she could be very, very strict with
Mhm.
devotees when the moment required it. In a way that was never about asserting her authority. That's not what it was about. It was very much about it was kind of it was I think I took it as the ultimate mark of respect towards the devotee. It's like I'm taking you at your word that you're serious about being here, and that you're serious about learning, and and progressing. So therefore I'm going to give it to you straight with both barrels. And I always appreciated that, and very much. And but I know there were some people that didn't like having that kind of truth presented to them. So it
Yeah.
wasn't everybody's cup of tea.
Yeah. So as you know, Jesus said, "Be in the world, but not of it." He also said, "Be wise as serpents, gentle as doves." But
Yes.
and that's been one of your mottos, not the second one, but the first one, the "Be in the world, but not of it." Um, how would you define that, and how have you lived that out so far?
Huh. Being in the world, not of it. Yeah, definitely my motto. It's well, basically bringing my practice and the realizations, that knowledge, into some kind of actual um not what the word isn't practice, the bring it into some kind of work,
Hmm.
basically. It's that simple in the world. And but always maintaining that balance. There's that sense of being here, and yet knowing that I come from somewhere else, that I'm part of something infinite, something larger. So even though I'm here represented in this finite body that we choose to call Jim, um, it's about always maintaining that essential contact with that greater source and allowing that source to basically emerge and speak through this channel, if I dare say that.
Yeah. And would you say also that doing that does not necessitate any kind of conceptualization? It's really more of an experiential thing,
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah,
you
very
know?
much, very
Yeah,
much.
it's not like you're running around philosophizing all day about how you're not really in this world and you're doing things in the world. No, it's more of the kind of the nitty gritty reality of your daily experience, right?
Yes, very much, and I'm actually very cautious about um, talking about it. As years go by, I'm less inclined to talk, about it. It's unless people ask, unless
Hmm.
people are, have specific questions and are interested in, you know, what that practice looks like.
Yeah,
But I'm also very what's the word? Very guarded or cautious against letting my intellect interfere with things. And when it gets into too much talking about it and conceptualizing about it, I just find that it becomes an impediment to that source, that channel, that presence coming through. And yeah, and I don't feel the need to label everything.
yeah. I saw a YouTube video yesterday, which was entitled something like, I had a spiritual awakening and now I've lost all motivation. I don't, and the guy went on to explain that he doesn't really have any initiative to do anything. Then he's lost all interest in the world as a result of his spiritual awakening. And I made a comment in the comment section under the video that, that's not the final awakening. Awakened people can be very motivated. It's just that there's a different intelligence driving the motivation. It's shifted from just individual intelligence to divine will or cosmic intelligence.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's what I feel. That's what I feel driving me. That's what I feel my experience to be, and um, it's interesting. There's it, 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 it's easy to sort of get excited about all of the things that quote unquote I would like to accomplish. But in this particular human vehicle, I'm also able to reflect that, oh, it's going to be whatever it's going to be, whatever, that infinite source has intended, whatever's going to be coming through. It's going to be whatever it's going to be. Like, some people, I'm interested in the physiological side, obviously, of everything.
Mhm.
Very much part of yogic practice is, maintaining your body, taking care of your body, um, and because this is the vehicle, and including your nervous system and everything else, that's going to be transmitting all of this energy and doing the work. Well, some people are very fortunate and blessed to be born in this world with a very, very healthy, strong body. We know that people are born with different cognitive, potentialities. We know that. Um, some people develop their potentiality. Some people have great potentiality, but don't develop it, for whatever number of reason. Same thing with our physical body. So we just have to make do with whatever we're given, if that makes sense. And I'm just grateful that I feel fortunate that I've been given a pretty healthy body and a healthy mind, and the opportunity to be exposed to a set of teachings that help to develop all the potentialities that this channel can be.
Yeah. No, it is a blessing for sure, and a precious opportunity, I would say. And
Yes,
and another quote would be, "The body is the temple of the soul." So it's the instrument through which the soul, if you will, functions. And that was one of my early realizations toward the end of my teenage drug phase. I was thinking, I'm stuck in this body, and if I damage it, I'm going to be stuck in a damaged body all of my probably short life. And so I better clean up my act, and start taking care of it.
yeah. Well, it's great that you had the presence of mind to recognize that, and and again, well, maybe there was some intervention there. Maybe some spark of the divine was intervening to say, well, this wasn't part of the plan for you, Rick.
Yeah, I think so. I often ponder that, and it wasn't obvious to me at the time, but in retrospect, you can kind of see the hand of the divine over the course of your life.
Yeah. Yes. Gosh, when you say that, it conjures up all sorts of memories for me.
Yeah.
Close calls and near misses and things,
Oh yeah, I drove my guardian angels crazy during during those days. Like, oh my God, what are we gonna do with this guy? They all had nervous breakdowns.
yeah.
Yeah. Um, okay, so going along to as this unfolds, we're talking about being guided by the divine and having it bless our lives or protect us from dangers or shift us in more wholesome directions and so on. And you know, and I imagine you would agree. It's obvious that this could mean different things for different people. Not everybody is meant to do the same thing. And so what would you say to the thought that um, being in an enlightened state or awakened state, um, and being guided by divine intelligence, having Brahman be the charioteer, to quote the Katha Upanishad, doesn't mean you're going to be doing earth shaking spiritual things, and be standing up on stage in front of thousands of people. You could be working an ordinary job, raising kids, doing all that ordinary stuff, and yet, well, take it from there.
Well, oh yeah, and the ripples. I always imagine. I always think about the ripple effect of every little effort that we make. And this is really important to me, and has been for years. But it becomes increasingly important to me with each passing year. I become even more aware of each little thing that I'm putting out in terms of my thoughts, in terms of little actions
Mm.
during the day. But I can tell you one prominent aspect of this the chosen work in my life, apart from being a father of three children and having really relished raising my children to the best of my ability. I wasn't a perfect father, but I think they would probably mostly tell you that I mostly did a good job. And they're all very beautiful people, so I'm very proud of them. Proud, it's not the right word, but
No, that's a
anyways,
good word.
yeah. And but one of the things I like to share is that for over, well, just about 25 years, I was a community soccer coach.
Hmm.
I'm really into soccer and
Hmm.
have been since I was a little boy. And I got into coaching, and I've coached all sorts of kids that were not my own. My own kids only briefly played soccer and got interested in other sports and whatnot, which was fine by me. But in coaching soccer, I always saw it as spiritual work. Let me just say that. I never said that to any of the kids or any of the parents, but and if any of them are watching now, they might be scratching their head or not. But for me, it was always about how can we say this? This operates on so many different levels. You must be familiar with the writings of Robert Bly,
Yeah, I
Iron
never read
John.
them, but I'm aware of him.
Yeah, and one of the themes that comes across in certainly Iron John is about boys need male figures who are positive,
Uh-huh.
and I saw that need in my community, and the same thing with you know, girls need positive models who are male and what have you. And I coach a lot of girls teams. But I want to say that beyond all the soccer and teaching how to pass and kick and shoot and tactical play and all that kind of stuff, it was always for me about infusing all of it with a sense of kindness and joy and, quite frankly, love.
Mm.
Everything for me was an expression of love. It was about seeing the inherent divinity in each of those people. And I would not hesitate to say that. Like, I mean, that I think it even surprised me perhaps my ability to be able to see the inherent divinity in each of those individuals, even a couple of the characters who were, who were misbehaving and disruptive and whatnot, and they know who they are. God bless them. And one of these guys came back to me years later, and we went out for beer. The team called me up, or somehow it happened, and we went out to the pub a few years ago. And these guys are all in their mid late 30s now, and at one point they're all sharing anecdotes and story, and but it was really pleasing to me that the one of these guys, he suddenly sort of dropped his head and was very feeling, you could just sort of sense of shame. He says, I was a real jerk. I was a real a-hole. And I just laughed and I said, yeah, but that's where you're at that time. And that's what was going on. And I understood that. And it's like, anyways,
Yeah,
that's me reminiscing for me, but
that's nice. Uh, you might like to check out this thing that a friend of mine is doing, who has been on Batgap a couple of times. Her name is Mariana Kaplan, and she and her son have been traveling all over the world, handing out soccer balls to kids who might be using like I don't know, just something to serve as a soccer ball that's not really a soccer ball. Places in Africa and Indonesia and places where kids can't afford soccer balls. So it's kind of this mission to sort of use soccer but that's not all they're handing out. I mean, it's like this mission to somehow propagate goodwill and positivity and spirituality through the avenue of soccer.
yeah.
You can Google it, you'll find it.
Marion Kaplan.
Mariana
Mariana Kaplan.
Kaplan, Kaplan.
Okay.
She's a psychotherapist and lives in Maine now. And she's written some really cool books like Halfway Up the Mountain, The Error of Premature Claims to Enlightenment. That's
Oh,
one.
yeah.
And Do You Need a Guru? That was another one. Interesting. And some others.
Oh, I'm already interested.
Yeah. You can see her interviews on Batgap. Anyway, yeah, it's a good thing you weren't a boxing coach. It might have been harder to instill love in your trainees. Okay, love this guy. Now knock his lights out. Okay, so I'm going by some notes you sent me, but we can meander away from those at any time, and we already have. This is a good one.
Good.
Yeah.
I like the meander.
The importance of not obsessing over dogma at the expense of losing touch with or becoming blind to intuitive learning and perception. I mean, you got your start in a Christian church. Presumably, it wasn't a very dogmatic one. But dogma is not limited to Christianity or religions or anything. I mean, there are people who are politically dogmatic. There are people who are perhaps even dogmatic about their soccer team. But also in the so-called spiritual world, New Age or contemporary spirituality, people can be very fixated on particular ideas and dismissive of those who think differently.
Oh, yeah. No, absolutely. And that's why I think for the most part, I've shied away from, being a part of any spiritual community. I really enjoy the encounters that I have with, other spiritual people who are um, engaged in some form of practice and who are very devoted to their practice. But I have the utmost faith that God, that infinite source, Brahman, whatever name we give to it, is always, well, the charioteer is always taking me where I need to be going, whether it's in work, in my family life, or in these relationships. And the word I like to use is around that phenomena, if it were, as it were, is emergence. But sorry, I'm meandering prematurely already. Going back to, but yeah, dogma. Yeah, no, suffice it to say, I rail against dogma in all forms. I embrace knowledge, I embrace truth, I embrace questioning. But even the Buddha talked about, that you have to doubt, you have to question things, and I'm suspicious even of myself if I become a little too attached to what I believe to be an absolute certainty.
Yeah, there's a great quote from the Buddha. I could pull it up if I took a few seconds, but he basically said, don't believe anything because the scriptures say it, because some authority says it. Don't even believe anything because I say it. Just like, really think about it, on your own and ponder it deeply. And then if it seems to be conducive to the well-being of everyone and so on and so forth, then put it into practice or abide by it.
Yeah.
And there's one more quote I want to throw out, relevant to something you said a couple of minutes ago, which I've said in many lectures, but I think it always bears repeating, which was from Padmasambhava, which was, although my awareness is as vast as the sky, my attention to karma is as fine as a grain of barley flour. Tell me why you like that quote, because I think you probably do.
Can you run the quote
Yeah.
by?
Although my awareness is as vast as the sky, my attention to karma is as fine as a grain of barley flour. Well, so as not to put you on the spot, I'll just say the reason I like that quote is that he's just saying that, hey, you can really be kind of cosmic, really an awakened dude, but it doesn't grant you a pass to do whatever the heck you please. You have to, be quite meticulous or impeccable in your behavior, and not deviate from the Tao, or the Dharma, and which it bears saying, because there are some people who take the opposite conclusion. They think, okay, well, now I'm enlightened, so I can do whatever I want, and I'd like to sleep with these various women who are coming to me, and after all, I'm not doing it. God is doing it, so it must be okay. Uh, so I helped to start an organization called the Association for Spiritual Integrity, because there has been so much hanky-panky in spiritual communities, and it's caused so much harm. So we got together with some friends and started this organization, and it's really doing well, and it seems to be striking a much needed chord.
Do you have a website for
Yeah,
that?
it's called spiritual-integrity.org. And we have like nearly 800 members now, and over 50 member organizations. And we've given presentations at Harvard Divinity School and so on. But
Huh.
it's an important thing. I'm a student of Swami Sarvapriyananda, among others. It's not like he's my guru or anything, but I like his classes. And he always emphasizes that ethical development is actually foundational. That's the first step, and then you
Hmm.
build everything else on top of that. And
Yeah.
I emphasize that because, again, of the sort of the harm that's been done by people who don't recognize that, and even some very well-known spiritual teachers. There was one at a conference in Denver a few months ago who said, if you think that ethics has anything to do with awakening, you don't understand awakening.
Yeah. Well, I want to go back to that quote. No, I like that very much, and the explanation you offered, or yeah, as my attention to karma is as fine as a grain of barley
Barley
flour.
flour, yeah.
I feel that
And he's saying,
very
even though my awareness is as vast as the
right.
sky. So he's saying, okay, I'm awakened, in whatever that meant in those days, but you got to be careful. Doesn't you don't just coast after that.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think part of what I take from that, or at least, yeah, this is what resonates for me, is that it's also the case that because your awareness has expanded as vast as the sky, I feel that it is incumbent upon me all the more to act with the utmost integrity. I really believe in that. I do believe that there is a distinction made. This is something that just comes from my intuition, I suppose, but I do suspect or believe there is a distinction to be made in terms of karma. If I go out and crash up a car and I don't know any better, well, that's one thing. But if you go out and crash up a car but you knew better, that's kind of a different thing. And I think in Islam they talk about that, the intention. What was the intention behind it?
Yeah,
Now,
like if an uneducated person commits a certain crime, okay, there would be some consequences. What if the judge does it? Same crime. The judge really should know better. Of course, in this day and age, the judge probably gets off and the other guy goes to jail. But you know,
right. And yeah, actually, and I have some experience with that, but we won't go into it in detail. But and I mean, this goes on all around the world. I think that's a really good analogy or example, because what happens then is that ultimately that break in trust, that break in integrity ends up, trickling down through the entire system, and it affects the whole organism.
Yeah,
And this is why it is absolutely essential, like your organization, um, to be maintaining integrity, to develop integrity.
yeah.
That, for in my case, that would go. I think that goes back to, well, it probably goes back to a lot of things, past lives, and what have you.
Mhm.
But I certainly attribute a lot of it to my early upbringing in that Anglican country parish,
Sure.
where I was surrounded by really good people, just really good, simple people who were very involved in the community. My mother was always involved in, like, for example, Meals on Wheels, helping people.
Hmm.
There was just this overriding sense of your responsibility to the community and to the people around you, like, to take care of people. And of course, part and parcel of that is it was a given that you have to act with integrity.
Yeah.
you know
And imagine, I mean, well, you can see what has happened in the Catholic Church and probably some other denominations where priests end up molesting children, and it's such a violation of trust, and it's so shattering of people's faith and so traumatizing. And I mean, this is kind of a crude example, but imagine if Yogacara Hamilton had said, "All right, guys, give me all your money, or take off your clothes, or whatever." Imagine the effect that would have had on your life
right,
at that
right.
young
And
age. Yeah.
yeah, and that was one of the things that, yeah, she never asked for money, like,
No,
not
of course.
once,
Right.
ever. And yeah, and and that's always stuck with me. I mean, she just transmitted it. I mean, again, there's that, just the living example of
Yeah.
integrity. And again, I'm so blessed and fortunate to have been able to have that kind of a teacher.
Yeah. Anyway, I don't want to sound preachy, and we don't need to dwell on this too long, but it's just in my position of being so interconnected with so many different people around the world, in the spiritual communities, and also through my involvement in the ASI. I just encounter so many examples of misbehavior, which is extremely traumatizing and disillusioning to people. And and I place such value on spiritual development, and it's for individuals and for the world, that it just seems like a tragedy when these things happen. And so, at the risk of sounding like a nagging prude, I like to just emphasize this pretty often in interviews.
Well, I'm right there with you on that. And like, yeah, at the risk of sounding like a nagging prude, I often have to sort of maybe check myself depending on who the audience is and who I'm talking with.
Yeah.
Um, because I don't know why it should be such a big concept for some people, but it is. I think it's because our whole notion of integrity and honesty in at large has become so diluted.
Yeah.
I'll give you one brief example.
Hmm.
I don't want to inadvertently reveal the person's identity, so I'll have to leave out all the sort of most salient details. But it basically,
Unfortunately, I'm not psychic like your teacher was, so I won't be able to guess.
but the essence was, this is a person, a colleague who I have high respect for, very high regard for, wonderful person, and an intrinsically, I'm going to say, an intrinsically good person. But they grew up in a certain region and in a certain culture, and despite their education and everything else, I made a comment about somebody that had demonstrated a lack of integrity in deceit,
Mhm.
whatnot. And this person said to me, they've responded, well, oh, but everybody does that.
Ah,
As in, it's normalized. This is, so that kind of behavior is not necessarily seen, even, and we're talking minor deceits and whatnot but but the fact that this notion very casually expressed of, oh, well, that's just normal, that's normal, that's what people.
yeah, that's an interesting thing. I mean, it brings up the point of, is our ethics cultural phenomenon, or do they have some universal value? Because you might grow up in a culture where everybody thinks, or you might have grown up in a culture in the 150 years ago in the States, where everybody thinks that it's okay to own black people, or in 1930s Germany, where Jews are, all the horrible things that people were saying about Jews, and little kids. I was just reading something the other day where somebody was so shocked because this little kid started saying these horrible things about Jews that he had heard them from his friends. So just because everybody does something doesn't mean it should be accepted. And I think some of our most inspiring people throughout history, like Mahatma Gandhi or Martin Luther King or others, were inspiring because they bucked the trend. They they didn't do what everybody else did. They said, "Wait a minute, this is wrong, and I'm going to speak out."
Right. And they were both, both of them were probably channeling a lot of Kundalini or something, because they had the power, not only the awareness, that sort of awakened mindset, but they also had the power and the strength and the confidence to be able to transmit that against the overwhelming odds that were against them.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and
Was it
that's
Margaret Mead said something like, don't think that that great changes can't be affected by a small group of dedicated people. In fact, that's the only thing that has ever brought about great changes. Something
yes,
like that.
yeah,
Misquoting her, but you've probably heard the quote.
yeah. That was a pretty reasonable, close paraphrase. So it
Yeah.
works. I was going to say, I like to quote from scripture, whether it's the Upanishads or the Bible. And when we were talking about integrity, one of my favorites is, and this is sort of we sort of already passed this topic, I suppose, but I always remember this one. In Jesus, he said, and now I'm going to paraphrase really badly. He said, "For any of those who would ever harm a child, it would be better if that a millstone was tied around their neck and they were dropped into the ocean." Uh,
Wow. I think a
yeah,
lot
it's
of priests somehow miss that verse.
yeah, yeah, pretty heavy karma. In other words, heavy karma
Yeah.
if you hurt
Interesting.
a child.
Okay, so and this everything we're saying here, it wouldn't be an abrupt segue to read your next point, which is the importance of simple humility and kindness. Let's dwell on that for a little bit.
Yeah, for me, I just one of the happy discoveries in my life, having heard this said, I guess, by especially a lot of the great Buddhist teachers, but
Hmm.
Yogananda talked about it a lot, is just the simple practice, making it a habit of being kind, making it a habit of demonstrating compassion, and of course there's research around this now too, in
Mm.
terms of the neurofeedback that comes back to us, um, and just witnessing the beauty that emerges from that. And then as you make it more and more of your habit, I like to talk with my hands.
That's
Uh,
okay.
um, it just becomes such a natural part of who we are, and it's like compounding interest on a really good investment portfolio.
Yeah,
It just grows.
it grows and it refines your nervous system, actually. You were talking earlier about the nervous system. Crude behavior coarsens the nervous system. Compassion, humility, kindness, that kind of stuff refines the nervous system. And a more refined nervous system is more suitable, if that's the best word, more capable of reflecting, pure consciousness and spiritual, divine values.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm always aware of that, like, and increasingly aware of that how everything contributes. It's a constant feedback loop, as we
Hmm.
practice these things, we're also refining the body, refining the mind, refining the spirit, the whole experience.
Yeah. I'm involved with this marvelous fellow named Nipun Mehta, who leads an organization called Service Space, servicespace.org. And he's behind this whole AI chatbot project that I've been involved with for a couple of years. I have something called the BatGap bot. But in any case, Service Space, its motto is small acts of kindness. and he just started out, I don't know, 25, 30 years ago with this. I think it was the first project was this thing called Karma Kitchen, where they opened a restaurant and anybody could come to eat, and afterwards you pay what you thought it was worth, or you just walk out if you don't want to pay. But it worked. People did it. They supported it, and then they've gone on to do all kinds of things, and now millions of people are involved all around the world doing wonderful things, just through this motto of small acts of kindness.
And it's interesting to witness, and beautiful to witness how a project like that, when it's coming from a good place, and it carries this initial vibration and this intention, and then it's subsequently building that energy and that intention and transmitting it to others. It catches fire and expands and grows, and if it's rooted in truth.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I'm kind of reminded at this point in our political scene of the importance of leaders reflecting these qualities of kindness and humility and so on. Unfortunately, the pendulum seems to have swung in a direction where that's not so much the case, but it really makes a difference. Imagine yourself like you were bullied as a kid. You talk about it in your book. And you can kind of imagine the playground scene where there's a bully, and then a certain mindset gravitates around the bully, and they become little mini bullies, following the big bully with whatever he does. And conversely, there might be someone who is just really kind and helpful to other kids and all that stuff, and probably he would attract a certain type of person. But the predominance of one or the other can shift in any circumstance, such as a playground or a nation or the world. And it has a huge, I don't know, it's funny, it's interesting to consider which is the cart and which is the horse. I mean, is there something in collective consciousness which would give rise to, despotic leaders? Or do despotic leaders bring out something in collective consciousness and enliven that tendency in the populace? I think it's the first, that there are certain elements or ingredients in collective consciousness that give rise to different types of leaders at different times. Give expression to those qualities in the person of this or that leader.
I would agree. Yeah, no, I would agree. I've often thought about that same question, and that's what it emerged for me and it's what I've observed. And you can observe this in different corporate cultures and different places I've worked. For example, I come in from the outside, and we have like a good leader. I join a really wonderful culture. This is, and I was attracted to that culture from the outset. And then say there's a leadership change, and lots of people who work in big organizations report this, of course. And then, oh my God, terrible news that our leader left and this new manager came in, and the people that were already there enjoying a happy culture, if they really are representative of that culture in terms of their own intrinsic values and virtues, they will leave. They will find ways to leave, or at the very least, they're probably going to stop being productive, because they're not in a happy place. And then by the same token, the people that will come in to replace those who have departed will be much more in the mold, somebody that doesn't mind that kind of a leader, and they
Right.
find that kind of person really appealing, you know. So that that's coming from those individuals, as far as I'm concerned, and yeah, I would agree. I think it emerges from that collective unconsciousness, and yeah.
Yeah, I think you mentioned before we started recording that a lot of Americans are moving to Canada these days, that you know
Yeah.
of.
Well, yeah, and it's funny. I think it's gonna, with time. I'm gonna make a prediction. I think it's gonna start to become sort of controversial in Canada, because the Americans who are moving here, for the most part, are those who have substantial resources to do
Sure.
so,
Yeah.
and they're coming up and buying, substantial properties
Driving
and
up the real
whatnot.
estate prices and so on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Hmm. Perhaps you should build a wall. Would have to be a long wall. Um,
Well, you know what? If there's enough tariffs put up against our softwood experts, we'd have that means we'd have a surplus of softwood. So
mhm.
we could build a wall out of, I don't know, spruce.
Right.
I don't know how effective that's going to be.
No, it might not be. People would drill holes in it. Okay, next point. You mentioned the importance and relevance at times of suffering in awakening. Now, there have been some spiritual aspirants who have intentionally inflicted suffering upon themselves through all kinds of austerities and tapas, it's sometimes called, and sometimes quite extreme. And we can picture yogis on beds of nails and so on, and others who haven't done that intentionally. I met a very wonderful. I had this cool experience where I was up in Iowa City because Irene had to go to the hospital for something, and I was coming out of I was walking down the aisle of a little food store where we had stopped to pick up something, and this young Buddhist nun, fairly young, kind of started walking toward me, and we both just stopped in our tracks. And I was like, "Whoa, are you from Fairfield, which is where I live?" And she said, "No, but you are." Uh, I said, "Do I know you? And are you from Fairfield?" She said, "No, but I know you. You're from Fairfield." So she had been watching Batgap. But why did I start on this? Oh, she's got a terrible case of cancer. I won't go into the details, but she's gone through horrendous suffering, and she said that she has just maintained this Buddhist attitude of, I'm taking on this suffering for humanity. It's not like, oh, poor me. It's more like, okay, I'm just going to go through this, and hopefully in doing so, I will relieve the suffering of others. Um, so, what would your take be? Why do we suffer? And, if God wants everybody to evolve and grow spiritually, why does suffering sometimes have to be part of it?
Um, I can only speak to my own experience, but
Hmm.
I know for myself, in the periods when I've suffered greatly, and there have been times I had just for example, there's been a few things in the last 10 years, but I had a strange mishap with my back about 2 years ago. And I was in such excruciating pain. I've had lots of back problems out through my over the years and whatnot, and it's like, oh, my back hurts, and oh, I can't sleep very well, and oh, it's really uncomfortable, and it's not pleasant. No, this was next
This is
level. I
off
had a
the charts,
major
yeah.
It was off the charts. It was a major pinched nerve
Yeah.
down at the base of my spine, and I lost feeling in my left leg that still hasn't fully returned. But my walking is good, and I can still run, play soccer, which makes me happy.
Attaboy. Bend it like Beckham.
Yeah, but the pain was so bad that I just slept on the hardwood floor of our living room for about 10 days,
Mm,
and I didn't dare try to sleep even on a thin foamy or anything, because
mm,
anything that would not support my back would just introduce that the slightest movement was just like agonizing pain that would go
mm.
straight to the top of my crown, and it was excuse me, when they talk about blinding pain,
Yeah.
that's the kind of pain this was. It was absolutely blinding. And I got to the point after a few days where, have some water. It got to the point after a few days where I was seriously wishing for death.
Mm,
And because you get to a point where it's just intolerable. Like, I just can't sustain this any longer. And at that point, that's when you touch something deeply. So this, circling back here after my long narrative, the pain, the suffering, when we really sit with it and be with it. And I was doing my best. I was practicing my breathing and everything else. But when we really, it forces us to touch bottom in a way that takes us to that source. There's no other place to go. The only place to go is that source. And that's been my experience. Like I say, all I can do is describe in my experience. Um, Having said that, and having described that particular anecdote, the big difference between back pain and, say, being in a conflict zone, in the world, where there's bombs falling and what have you. There's different kinds of suffering, and I suspect, like, when you What a terrible thing for a parent to lose their child. I can't imagine, the pain in that. Um, but I suspect that in that there is a kind of a deeper learning probably around non-attachment. One of the things that my guru used to say, this is her sense of humor, but I mean it was also dead serious too. One thing we need to remember, she said, no one gets out of here alive.
Yeah, that's an old one. She didn't make that up.
Oh yeah, no one gets out of here alive. And so, I mean, that might provide cold comfort, but I do think it's a reference point that we need to look to. I had occasion to travel to China 10 years ago, and long story, but there I just happened to meet with a group of Tibetan Buddhists. These are, interesting enough, ethnic Chinese who practice Tibetan Buddhism. And I was suspicious and skeptical, but when I actually talked with them at length about their practices, I was impressed. Like, as best as I can tell, they are practicing, the real deal. But anyways, and very, very sincere aspirants. And one of the things that, that comes out of Tibetan Buddhism is this notion of constantly, not constantly, but always having an awareness of death, always having an awareness of our mortality.
Yeah.
And I know that's a current that I guess runs through all of Buddhism, but in Tibet in particular, it's a very strong current. If I understand correctly, I think traditionally a lot of Buddhist families would have a skull, on a mantelpiece somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
That as a child, growing up with this skull sitting up, Happy Halloween, sitting on the on the fireplace. But just simply as a means of reminding people that, hey, you're not going to be here forever. And people in the developing world know this well. Like, you could get sick tomorrow and, good luck. You could be dead by the end of the week. And that happens all too often. And enough that people live with this awareness that I don't think we have so much of that in the developed world. And I'm really meandering. I hope that's okay.
No, it's okay. I mean, it depends. I mean, there are places in the so-called developed world where, a good chance your child's going to get shot, on the way home from school or something, like, south side of Chicago or whatever. And so, but it is a theme in most spiritual traditions, to contemplate your mortality. And there's a famous portrait of, maybe it was by Rembrandt or somebody, of this monk contemplating a skull, just kind of looking at it.
Yeah.
I forget the artist, but
German artist now.
was it German? Okay.
Yeah, I forget his name now.
But in any case, I mean, that's the reality of the situation. We only live for a snap of the fingers in the cosmic time scale of things. So eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you may die, is not necessarily the best strategy, because when you do, will eating, drinking, and merriment have actually fulfilled your purpose for being here?
No. Yeah. Not likely. Yeah. It's I think you always, in that regard, we just always have to turn our attention to doing as much good as we can. And I use the word good very loosely. Nothing is either good or bad, but thinking only makes it so, as Hamlet.
Was that Hamlet? I was thinking it was Shakespeare. Yeah.
Yeah, Hamlet. Act 2, Scene 2, maybe.
Huh.
Yeah.
Okay, so we might have covered that one. In any of these points, we could have talked for the whole time about it, and maybe we'll get together sometime and just shoot the breeze. But it's good to skip along, and if people want to hear more about any particular thing we're raising, they could send in a question. At least one question has come in so far, but I'll wait for Irene to send it over to me. Okay, the importance of different traditions and teachers. You've mentioned you've lived with a prominent leader who spoke with you about traditional shamanic practices, contact with sky people, forest spirits, lucid dreams. You live 5 houses away from a Tibetan Lama, and you discuss the nature of perception with him. And you mentioned we can deepen our understanding of our own experience and traditions by talking with people of other traditions and comparing notes. I very much agree with that. I used to be much more monochromatic in my spiritual pursuit when I was just heavily into the TM movement. I would read things. I read Carlos Castaneda and various books, but I kind of had the attitude that, oh, the thing I'm doing is the best thing, which a lot of spiritual people feel, because if they thought theirs was second best, they'd probably leave it and do what they thought was the best. But in any case, I've found it very enriching now, especially doing what I do, to expose myself deeply to so many different perspectives. It really broadens my perspective and enriches it a lot.
Yeah, and what interests me is the points of intersection, between different faiths in
Hmm.
particular. um, because ultimately, I think all religions, including the yogic traditions, right? There's this great trap that over time they fall into sort of systems of religiosity,
Yeah.
and which is to say dogma, and which is by its nature leads to a certain kind of closed mindedness,
Hmm.
and also it leads to creating layers upon layers of rules and beliefs and God knows what concepts, you know
Yeah.
that take us further and further away from the elemental truth of things. And the elemental truth is something, well, that is nameless and cannot be spoken in words, for starters. And but that elemental truth has appeared in all of these great faiths, in all of these great traditions, including certainly the indigenous traditions and Aboriginal traditions in Australia. And so, I always encourage people to look at those things and acknowledge those things. And because it's a beautiful testament to the fact that there is this universal uh, element and truth to everything, that lives beyond the dogma and all of the religiosity.
Yeah. There's a story where God and the devil are walking down the road, and God sees something shiny on the ground, picks it up, puts it in his pocket. And the devil says, "Oh, what'd you find? What's that?" And God said, "Oh, it's just the truth." And the devil says, "Oh, give it to me. I'll organize it for you."
Oh, that's good. Oh, I like that.
Yeah, I was thinking of this earlier, as like half an hour ago. It's like I was chatting with somebody the other day who spent a lot of time in Thich Nhat Hanh's community. And Thich Nhat Hanh's, yeah, totally sweet, saintly man. And she
I
said,
love Thich Nhat Hanh, I
yeah,
gotta
she
say.
said she had to leave there because of all the power trips that people were on. And it's like, you could have anybody. I mean, this even happened around Jesus, but anybody. And there's always going to be kind of administrative types who are going to want to wriggle in there and start, you know, start amassing power and pushing people around. And I mean, anybody who's been in any spiritual organization can relate to what I'm saying.
Oh, I've witnessed that. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. Yes, I've witnessed that, and I'm a big fan of Thich Nhat Hanh. I love Thich Nhat Hanh. Anytime I see anything from him, wow, everything that comes out of him is just this, for me, this pure fountain of truth. It's interesting when you talk about organizing. Somebody who I really appreciated in that regard was Joel Goldsmith. Have you ever read much of Joel Goldsmith?
Not much. I've heard of him, and I know you mentioned him. I might have read a little bit or heard a little bit of some audio file or something, but I never really got into him. What was he all about?
Um, Joel Goldsmith was. I'll tell briefly. Give a bio for anybody that's not familiar with Joel Goldsmith. I noticed recently that Eckhart Tolle had a quote of how much he appreciated Joel Goldsmith on the back of
Uh-huh.
a republished book of Goldsmith. So Goldsmith was alive from. He was a contemporary of Yogananda, as it would happen. Born in 1892, died in 1964.
Mhm.
Um, and he was raised as a non-practicing Jew in New York City, whose dad had some kind of textile importation business, and they would make frequent business trips to Europe. And he was agnostic. And on one business trip, they're on a transatlantic voyage. He witnessed someone get a hands-on laying of hands healing, and he was just curious. And he says, "Well, what was that about? What did I just witness?" And he found out that these people were Christian scientists. And he went, "Oh, that's interesting. I might like to know a little bit more about that." And there again, the sort of the spark of the divine, perhaps, prompting him and leading him. So he subsequently joined the Christian Science community and started practicing healing, and very quickly became kind of the best healer in the community.
Hmm.
And at some point, the story went something like this. And this is again another example of what happens within spiritual communities and around dogma and whatnot. Uh, they were having some discussion about, well, when you lay on the hands, it's like this and it's like that, and this is how it works. And Goldsmith just sort of put his head. He goes, well, actually, no, that's not precisely what's going on. What's really happening is blah 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 blah. And they promptly, excommunicated him
Uh,
basically, which was ultimately all for the betterment of the world. I think because I'm a big fan of Goldsmith.
yeah.
Um, Goldsmith subsequently went on to open his own healing practice, but it was all coming. He started having all sorts of mystical experiences. I think it's never been made clear to me in everything I've read about him, but he obviously started to read about other traditions like Taoism, Buddhism, and he was versed. And he certainly started reading the Bible. And so his books can be kind of dense. He likes to quote from the Bible and he likes to
Mm,
quote from the Old Testament. And so his writing style can sometimes be a bit heavy, a bit, somewhat impenetrable almost.
mm,
But it always is based in the primacy of experience, direct experience, and this notion of the presence that is with us at all times and that we are part of. And his favorite book of his, I think, 15 books he wrote is called Practicing the Presence.
mm.
And I would highly recommend that to anybody that feels directed towards that kind of thing, that kind of writing. But where was I going with all of that?
Oh, you
Singing.
just tell us about Joe Goldsmith.
Yeah, and singing praises of Joel Goldsmith. Here's an anecdote I really like. It's somewhat apocryphal and uncertain as to the truth of it. That is, and but you're familiar with Robert Adams.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So
Who turned
Robert
out to be
Adams.
a bit of a fraud, but go ahead.
Oh yeah. Well, and this is why I think there's some question as to the veracity behind
Right.
this story. But as he told the story of his, how he found Ramana Maharshi.
Which he
Uh,
didn't, but go ahead.
oh, there you go.
He never went to India.
Really? Well,
Yeah.
look.
There's a whole story about this, but yeah. But he wrote a nice book.
Okay, well then maybe we could just
Yep.
unpack this as a good story then,
Yeah.
because obviously he was a good storyteller because he had me convinced. No, that's me. I tend to take people at face value.
Me too. Here's one of my main slogans. I take people at face value. I give them the benefit of the doubt, but I also take everybody with a grain of salt, and proportions vary.
Yeah. Yeah.
You want to tell me the Earth is flat? Okay, that's like 99.99% salt. You know, have aliens visited the Earth? Probably, maybe that's 75%.
Yeah.
Probability.
Yeah.
There's a great quote from Aldous Huxley. He said the greatest innovation of the scientific revolution was the scientific method itself, and particularly the working hypothesis. And if you think of it, anything can be any spiritual idea, let's say, that people have killed each other over or believe in or whatever, or told they'll go to hell if they don't believe in, can be taken as a working hypothesis. Let's see if there's evidence for it. And maybe it's true even if you can't actually prove it in your lifetime, because how can you prove that, let's say you go to heaven after you die? Well, there's some evidence for that because people have near-death experiences, they remember past lives and so on. But we don't have to hold rigidly to, and we were talking about dogma earlier, we don't have to hold rigidly to any particular idea. Treat it as a working hypothesis and see if you can substantiate it through your own experience or not, or maybe somebody else's experience seems credible and they've substantiated it. but everything is subject to revision, to reinforcement through more evidence, or through diminishment through refutation of apparent evidence, and so on.
Yeah, no, I yeah, wholeheartedly agree with that as
Yeah.
well. It start, yeah, work with a hypothesis and test it, and don't be afraid to test it.
Yeah.
And all too often, we're discouraged from doing that. It made me think of a saying, and I'm not sure quite where this comes from in the scientific community, but you've heard that expression, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
Yeah, that's good. Right. Yeah. So, in other words, let's take an example. So, um, we don't know if there are other universes. Some people have this multiverse theory that we're only one of billions of universes. There's no evidence for it, and there could never be any evidence that we know of because of the limitations of the speed of light and all that. But it doesn't mean there aren't other universes. That there's, it's not evidence of there not being other universes. There might be, but we'll never have any evidence to prove it one way or the other. Probably.
Yeah,
Shouldn't say never.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, really good example, and there's so many others where basically we don't have and will never have the technology available to us where we can take those kinds of measurements. In many cases, that
Right.
we're stuck within this three-dimensional physical plane, and multiverse, obviously, by its very nature, exists in other dimensional planes, and we don't have access to them, and I don't know how we ever will, other than through out-of-body experiences and
Yeah.
travel, soul travel.
Yeah. Okay. So what are we doing? Um, you said first and foremost, I'm interested in all the various subjects that were listed in our online information form. Yeah, we have all these categories, and people can check which one they fit into. You and I are kind of alike in this sense. Everything from Advaita Vedanta to reincarnation, ghosts. I've had experience with basically everything that appeared on that master list, including ghosts and visitors. I feel like all those things are meaningful in our awakening as we can make sense of it all. Um, yeah, one thing I would say is, and we'll see what you have to say about this, is even though there might be a million different things which actually exist in some way, shape, or form, there's not time in life to investigate them all. We can't all be ghostbusters or whatever. Um, but
Yeah.
but that's not to say they don't exist. And perhaps I mean, sometimes you can check out something for just an afternoon, read an article or something, and then okay, got it. Don't need to know more about that. But I'm open to the possibility that it exists.
Yeah, yeah, it's and I would say my approach to all of that um, is just take it as it comes, kind of thing, and but not to get overly distracted by it. One of the conversations I had with the Tibetan Buddhist Lama down the road from me, who I started meeting for tea on occasions, is we had a couple of discussions, I would say, around the whole notion of phenomenological experience. That there's so much of this stuff is just plain old phenomenon, and it's interesting phenomenon. And like, I don't know, seeing ghosts and maybe meeting extraterrestrials or whatever. But it just as remarkable as those things appear to our human consciousness, we we need to remember that there's something far more substantial behind all of those phenomena, and we ourselves are merely one expression of phenomena in this universe.
Hmm.
So to the same degree that we wouldn't take ourselves all that seriously in terms of, like, this vessel is called Jim, you know and I've had that experience, of course. I live with that experience and that awareness that I look in the mirror and I go, who is that guy? you know that's not the real essence of what this being is. And so, to the same measure that I'm not going to take this phenomena all that seriously, I'm not going to get too obsessed about these other phenomena either. Now, having said that, though, I do think it's important to acknowledge these phenomena, because what I've experienced and what I've witnessed in others is, as you're traveling along your merry way through life, on some occasion you'll have one of these experiences of these other phenomena. And it can be, quite disoriented, and it can shake people up and be confusing. I'll go back to my guru and what she said about these things. She said, "Yeah, there's all sorts of signposts and things that you're going to see along the road as you're traveling, but just sort of acknowledge them and don't get hung up on them, and just keep on trucking, kind of thing."
Yeah, no, that's good advice. Now, of course, one might wish to specialize in something. For instance, there's a guy named Jim Tucker who took over the work of Ian Stevenson on
Oh,
reincarnation. I've
yeah,
interviewed Jim, and he devoted many years of his life to studying reincarnation. So it's nice, it's good to have specialists. I mean, there are people who devote their lives to studying the UFO phenomenon. But so it's not to say that you can't be a seeker of enlightenment, which is the ultimate realization, and yet not have an interest in one of these particular branches. But if you lose sight of the forest for the tree, if you lose the sight of the whole because you've gotten so obsessed with a particular part, then perhaps you've missed the boat.
yeah, yeah. Thank you. That you are again articulated it better. That's what I was reaching for, was precisely that. Because there's certainly things, sort of niche interests and topics that I'm interested in that I find, really interesting and amusing, um, and have explored. Uh, but like I say, as long as we don't let that sort of become the all-consuming kind
Yeah.
of. So
One thought that's been kicking around my head as we've been talking is, at times we've talked about different traditions and how they all have their value and significance and so on. I don't like to limit it to the Earth. I'm I'm reminded of Carl Sagan's pale blue dot photo, if you've ever seen that, where it's a picture
yeah,
of the Earth taken from out by the rings of Saturn or someplace. And he comments on how all the wars and territory grabs and power struggles and everything that have happened on this little pale blue dot, and how absurd that seems. But if you consider the number of inhabited planets that probably exist in our universe, then each of them probably have numerous spiritual traditions going back, throughout their history, most of which probably claim that theirs is the only one or the best one or so on. Um, it helps to zoom out to that extent, I think.
that is I never thought of it that way. I've certainly thought about, there's got to be a lot of planets in a universe that's full of, as Carl Sagan said, billions upon billions of
Yeah.
stars, in universes or planets. But I never thought of it that way. Each of them would have their own religion, and each of them would think
Multiple
they're
religions. Yeah.
the one and only true.
Yeah. I mean, even if there's only one advanced
Right.
civilization in each galaxy, there are trillions of advanced civilizations in the universe. And undoubtedly, there are a lot more. I mean, with our modern telescopes now, we can see that almost every star has planets around it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. No, that's it's no, it's fascinating, and I think it's useful for people to remember that. For any of the skeptics out there, there's definitely got to be life out there.
Yeah. Here's a question from Marie in Colorado. If the mind or consciousness is the rider of the physical body horse, then the rider needs to control the horse, but also take good care of a horse. You can't dismount. That's a good way of putting it. It kind of relates to what we said. Like, you're not going to get off this horse, so you better take good care of it and also be a skillful rider.
Yeah, no, well said, well said. And I'm very fond of making analogies and creating metaphors, and I like that one.
Yeah. Okay, good. So, Jim, as we go along here, if any thoughts come to your mind that I'm not bringing up, feel free to bring them up. You don't have to wait for me. We've talked a bit about living in the world, but not of it. We've talked about reincarnation. You've had a bunch of past life regressions, right?
Yeah.
And you actually remembered a bunch of stuff.
Oh yeah, yeah, and yes, and I was glad that you mentioned Ian Stevenson, and I make reference to him in my book, and my interest in that whole topic and
Yeah.
area.
You also mentioned Michael Newton, who's a good one to read.
Yeah, yeah, and so I started off by doing, oh, I don't know, probably 15 years ago, I used an audio cassette with a script from Brian Weiss, who of
Hmm.
course is a big figure in that space. Uh, and I did some regressions at home, and they're very short. The induction where you're relaxing, meditating is maybe 15, 20 minutes. And then the actual guided meditation where you're sort of prompted with little questions as to, okay, where are you? What do you see? What's happening? And the images spontaneously come to your mind, like quite clearly in this case, because um, I suppose from years of meditating, visual, comes up quite easily, the visual aspect of it. Um, Anyways, yeah, no, I've had all kinds of experiences that I felt very deeply were showing me. Well, they touch. It definitely goes beyond intellect. Each of these experiences, I felt sort of they showed me something, but at a much deeper level, something clicked. That's all I can say, and a healing took place, or a certain either a healing took place of some aspect of my, this present character, or a new understanding came to light. And the test of time has shown that, and these things have stayed with me, so they've survived the test of time. Now, more recently in 2021, I had something that had been bothering me for quite a while. Sort of basically a blockage in my heart chakra. That's how I could describe it, and I knew it was there, and it was something that I wasn't getting past. And then it occurred to me, having read all kinds of Michael Newton and Brian Weiss and whatnot, I'm not getting any sort of conscious awareness of this from my current lifetime of what this could be. And I thought, I wonder if this could be something from a past life. And that's why I'm having a hard time shaking it. So anyways, on that suspicion, I went to the Michael Newton Institute website online, and they have a page there where you can type in the name of your state and your province, as it would be in Canada, and your city, and they will. It provides a list of counselors who are trained in his methodology. And it happened that there was a woman just up the road from me. I mean, look at this. Just like a mile away from me, just up the road. And so I gave her a call, and we had a nice chat. And she said, "Yeah, it sounds like this could be it." And so I went and did a couple of sessions with her, and that healing took place. Like, it was remarkable, what happened. I don't know if I need to go into the details of what the past life was. Well, maybe that'll
And
be
if you
interesting.
want,
Yeah, probably be interesting to people. It's it, for anyone who hasn't experienced this, it sort of share it detail by detail. It's just so remarkable. Now, she took me through like a 1 hour induction process. That is, deep relaxation, deep meditation. There's gentle music playing, and you're laying down on the sofa. And I want to emphasize, at no point in this process did I forget that my name's Jim and that I live in Victoria. Like, that, you don't start thinking you're a chicken or running around or anything like that. There's nothing like that. Um, but then as she starts to provide prompts, you get past the induction process, and she says, okay, you're walking down the stairs, you step through the doors into the light. Now look down at your feet, and what do you see? So here's what I saw. And I'd been through this before with the Brian Weiss tapes, all sort of similar process. And I look, and I've had, bare feet in the past, or a bit sandals, and,
cloven
all kinds.
hooves.
Yeah, yeah, not quite. But um, I looked down at my feet on this occasion, and I'm wearing these furry boots.
Hmm.
And the conscious Jim is still there as a participant, as an observer. And she warned me about this. She said, look, your critical intellect is going to want to jump in at different moments, and start, trying to analyze or understand. And said, look, try not to do that. Just try to sort of hold that at bay and just take in what you're seeing. And take, oops, sorry, get my hands. I'm talking with my hands too much. And uh,
Take
and
in
just
what you're seeing. Yeah, don't let your intellect get in the way.
yeah. And uh, so what do I see? I see these furry
Furry
boots.
boots.
Yeah, they're made of fur, and they're sort of, the toes sort of are drawn up like little curly toes, but they're like definitely made of fur. Like,
Hmm.
I don't know, looks like muskrat or something, or
I think in
like what the.
Lapland or something, don't they have boots like that where the toes curl up?
Aha, yes,
Huh.
my dear Watson. So, and but that's not what came to me. I mean, I just like, what the heck are these boots, you know? And then we're moving along. I said, okay, now look at your hands. And I go, oh, I got these big, you know, sort of powerful working hands. And are you a man or a woman? And it's just like, you know, like everything just comes like this when you're in this deep state. And oh man. And it's like, oh, how old are you? 36. What's your name? Lars. I'd always laugh. My brother and I, we grew up in a logging town, and there's a lot of old Norwegians in our logging town, you know, and there's a certain character. And apologies to all the people of Norwegian heritage out there, but we always, you know, sort of have have certain comments to make about Norwegian people. Basically, dour, you know, pretty serious, really hard working, you know, really hard working. And this experience that I had was again another testament to that. So I'm Lars, and I'm standing in a pasture. You know, where are you? And it's kind of dark. It's twilight. Is your house nearby? And I go, yeah, I think so. And it's like my vision turns right around, and I'm looking the other way, and I see this house, and it's in the distance, like 100 yards away, and it's like a log house, but it's red, and the roof is, and it's got white windows, and the roof is bright, bright green, like, you know, Kelly green.
Hmm.
And again, my critical intellect is looking at this, going, "What?" I've done roofing. I years ago worked in construction or whatnot, and I'm like, "Green roof, like it doesn't compute. This doesn't make any damn sense."
Hmm.
So, anyways, went through the whole experience, you know, and you get led through the regression, and eventually I died and what have you. And I had a hard time transitioning to the light, and it all had to do with this deep, deep, deep grief where my parents basically didn't really love me, didn't show me any tender care, but they used me because this is back around the year 1800. And as we know, in those days, if you're living, we're subsistence farmers. Sorry, I'm not providing all the details here. Um, and there's no such thing as old age care homes. So, you know, the son or the children are expected to take care of the parents as they get old. And so that was me. That was my role. And I never married, never had kids, never had family. Had a miserable life. It was awful. And on top of that, my parents didn't love me. They more or less, actually, they almost despised me. You know, there's this sense that they thought I was stupid, and but I was a useful, you know,
Useful idiot. Yeah.
yeah, useful workhorse for them. And anyway, so subsequent to this, I went on Google. You know, I got home and I cleared all this stuff, by the way. And there was all kinds of crying and sobbing and powerful stuff as I transitioned to the light. And this very, very skilled counselor took me through that.
Hmm.
And so it's all good, happy ending to the story. So I go to Google later though, and I had oh yeah, and it did come to light that this was, where am I? You know, where are you? And the answer came, you know, like that. It was Scandinavia,
Hmm.
and it's like Norway, I think, you know. And anyway, so later I did a Google and I start looking at images and log cabin Norway in Scandinavia, red, and then all these images start coming up, and lo and behold, never completely unbeknownst to me, that's a standard architectural form that dates back to like something like the 1300s or the 1400s, where, you know, log cabin, painted bright red, white
Hmm.
windows, and the roof, of course, is a green sod roof.
As I was thinking, it was plants of some kind. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was you know, my wife tells me I take too long in telling stories. I hope
That's
I'm,
okay. Sometimes you need the details.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. So here was a case where past life regression actually healed something. And did you notice a change in your heart chakra after that?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah,
Huh.
very, very, very big. And it was really interesting because, you know, in this, you know, like the Michael Newton methodology, at least, you can summon the guides, right? So
Yeah.
she says to me, if you like, you can summon your guides to help you. Because I was convulsing on the table. And at some point, I thought I was going to have a heart attack
Wow.
almost. But I decided I was going to stay the course because I could just sense I wanted this to be done with. And the guide comes, and it's a presence that you feel. And the counselor, through this process, again, if you've never been through it, starts prompting and says, "Okay, now Jim, I'm going to talk to your guide, if that's okay." Yeah, that's okay. And as soon as you give that consent, then she starts asking questions to the guide, and lo and behold, I'm speaking whatever it is that the guide has to say.
Oh.
And again, the conscious Jim of the 21st century is just observing this, going, wow, this is interesting. I'm not making this up. Like, this is just, it's coming from someplace.
Yeah.
I'm sharing this because what the guide had to say was fascinating. Said that my heart was, what did it say? My heart was upside down,
Huh.
and which later I took to mean that basically, if we think, according to yogic theory, the chakras, of course, are spinning, right? And they're supposed to spin in a particular direction. But mine, I take it to mean that I think mine was inverted,
Hmm.
you know. And this comes from the pain of deep trauma and not being loved and all that kind of stuff. But basically, at that point, the guides reached into my chest and took hold. I actually felt, I swear to God, I felt like somebody was doing live surgery on me. Like I felt hands reach into my chest, grab my heart, and turn it around. And in that process, it was as painful as you could imagine if someone was to take your heart and
Wow.
and turn it around. And I was in agony. And I don't want to scare anybody by sharing this, but I was in physical agony as this was taking place. But again, when I came through it at the other side, I'm really grateful for the experience, and it's absolutely been a life changer for me. So
Yeah. It's interesting to consider how deep certain traumas might be that we carry around with us, and how it influences or restricts our behavior or our experience. And interesting to consider what it might take to actually unravel those or heal those.
yeah, I'm very interested in that, and for the sake of so many people that need deep healing. And through my own experiences, I've been convinced of the value of, that kind of somatic healing and
Mhm.
somatic processes. I've done other stuff prior to that too. Years ago, I did a weekend workshop in Vancouver that involved holotropic breathing.
Oh yeah.
And, it's not something I would advise for a lot of people. I'm
Mm.
not a I'm not a big fan of, I think it's gotten a little bit too popular. I think, there are risks associated with that. But again,
Yeah.
in my case, I was following my higher guidance. I felt directed to pursue that, and it had a really positive effect on me. But again, that was probably my first real powerful experience in a somatic healing
Yeah.
experience.
Well, this brings up an interesting question. You've tried a lot of things. What is how do you balance kind of an open-minded, exploratory attitude where you're willing to try a whole lot of things without becoming a dilettante, a superficial dabbler? Can you go both deep and broad at the same time? Or just to finish my question, some say you should dig one deep well rather than 10 shallow wells. But I would say, well, how about if you could use 10 different tools to dig the one deep well, maybe a jackhammer and a pickaxe and a shovel and you know. So anyway, how do you reconcile that?
Oh, I like what you just said.
Mm,
Let's use 10 different tools to dig the one deep well.
yeah.
Absolutely. Um, the first thing I went to, but I like your version better. First thing I went to was, no, I'm working one deep well, but along the way I pick up, little tidbits here and there, other things because um, as much as if I was to sort of give a percentage value to my practice, like my yogic practice, I feel like encompasses 90% of what I need in my life. But occasionally, well, I should say it encompasses 100% of what I need. However, but there's been some moments and some things that were like I always describe it as a log jam. And you can meditate all you want on this. You can do all the breathing, and you can have samadhi experiences. You can have all these things, but there's some things that are really hard to dislodge. And I don't think there's anything wrong with using whatever tool you have to get that junk, that debris out of the way. But I would agree, like, I don't believe in being a dilettante. That's at all. Like, I would discourage people from that. Don't just sort of jump around. Like, this year I'm a Buddhist. Last year I was a yogi. The year before I was a Muslim. There are people that do that, and no, that's not not a good way.
Yeah. Um, that brought up an interesting thought, which is I often discuss this with a friend of mine, which is there have been so many like really impressive spiritual teachers, many of them world famous, who had great gifts, but really had some personal hangups or problems, either with sexuality or with anger or various other things, and really, really quite hypocritical in their behavior, quite harmful to people. And what you were saying is you can have all these samadhis and so on, um, but it doesn't necessarily crack these or heal or change these deep grooves, these deep patterns. So I'm wondering, some people say that perhaps we need a blend of kind of the ancient Eastern spirituality with modern psychology, and that some of these gurus would do well to have been in therapy or something, and they might not have, gone off the track, off the rails as they did. Have you ever given any thought to that notion?
Oh yeah, very much. Yeah, and I'm wholly in agreement with that. It, I've had various conversations with a good friend of mine here around precisely that. The In our own observations, the need to deal with some of those fundamental psychological um, pieces of debris, prior to, well, not necessarily prior to engaging in your practice, but certainly alongside. Like, there's certain things that have to be healed. And it sort of goes back, I think, to something you said earlier. Um, about your awareness being as broad as the sky, and your attention to karma
Right.
and the grain of barley flour. Um, but people want to have that blissful experience, that transcendental experience all the time, and like, I want to be soaring through the sky, and embracing the all. And yeah, but you got some hangups, man.
Eh,
There's some stuff there that needs to be dealt with, and I mean, so a lot of that stuff gets worked out through the activation and the channeling of Kundalini,
mhm.
right? As it rises through the Sushumna, and it's clearing stuff out, and it's clearing out debris along the way. Um, but it doesn't mean to say, going back to the well with the many tools. There's no reason why you couldn't also use a few other tools to clear out some of that debris, and it would help you a great deal in those instances where your kundalini is activating your second chakra, or your
Yeah.
and it's encountering some debris. If maybe there's too much debris there, and if you had cleared it out ahead of time, it'd be a bit much easier time.
Yeah. So perhaps if I could summarize this point, it would be to say that a person can apparently have achieved enlightenment and really sort of have r- powerful shakti and radiant presence and siddhis and all kinds of other things, and yet still have flaws that they might not themselves even be aware of. And so somehow or other, I think we need to evolve into a even more mature spirituality in this world, where we understand, that perhaps that we're always going to be a work in progress, and that we always have to be vigilant, and that there'll never be a time at which we can just rest on our laurels and proclaim ourselves finished. Or I'm not sure. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah, we cannot rest on our laurels. This is one of the things I like about, in my view, uh, this is one of the things I like about Joel Goldsmith. So he called his path, for better or for worse, he called it the infinite way.
Uh-huh.
And in his opinion, it was this constant unfoldment. And we could probably see that in relation to the notion of the ever expanding universe. The ever expanding creation around us, and we are obviously part of that, part and parcel of that. And so there's always something new. There's always new growth. There's always new, levels of awakening and what have you. One of the things that Goldsmith said that I really liked, and I think is germane to what we're discussing here, is he said, every day you must receive new manna from heaven.
Hmm.
And he speaks in all these sort of literary metaphors and what have you, and that's an allusion, of course, to the Old Testament. And the Israelites were in the desert, and they're starving and whatnot, but God sends them manna from heaven. And it's this notion of receiving the spiritual food and being fed. Well, a lot of people who they're halfway up the mountain, like the Mariana Kaplan book, I guess.
Yeah.
They say, oh yeah, I've had these experiences, I'm already there, I'm just going to sit back and I'm the guru now. And it's like, nah, there's always more. And there's that you run the hazard there of cutting off that source of manna from heaven. That manna has to be replenished every day. And Goldsmith says, it's no good to sort of rely on yesterday's newspapers. Yeah, who needs yesterday's papers?
Yeah.
You can't rely
Rolling
on
Stones song.
yesterday's. Yeah, yeah. You can't rely on yesterday's manna.
Yeah.
That was wonderful, but that was intended for that moment. And
Uh,
today's a new day, and every day has to be renewed, new manna from heaven. So somewhere in there, I guess what I'm getting at is that is the trappings that a lot of people fall into. A lot of very awakened, people who've had a lot of awakening experiences. They basically stop questioning. They stop seeking. They're sort of resting on their laurels, as you say, and as a consequence, they're not necessarily rooting out those little things, those little unresolved issues and
or
items.
big things, as the case may be. Yeah.
Oh yeah,
That's great. Have you ever read the Lord of the Rings books, or seen the movies at least?
I've seen the movies. I tried to read them years ago, and I'm not. I have a hard time with fantasy. I just
Uh,
it's not my vibe.
well, the reason they came to mind is, the Ring itself, of course, had this incredibly addictive quality, um, and um, and you had to be really humble and simple to be the bearer of the ring, or else it would go to your head and you'd be in big trouble. But towards the end of the book, spoiler alert, as Frodo gets to the Mount Doom or whatever it's called, where he has to throw the ring in to destroy it, the closer he gets to that point, the more magnified his ego becomes, because it's kind of like the ultimate test as you get close to the final realization. And the only reason he managed to achieve his purpose was that Gollum, who had coveted the ring, kind of lunges at him at the last minute and bites his finger off to get the ring, and then Gollum and the ring fall into the fire, and the ring gets destroyed. And as soon as that happens, Frodo is freed from the egomania that had afflicted him as he got so close to the final achievement. Uh, but anyway, that whole thing is metaphorically appropriate to what we're talking about.
Oh, it's spot on. It's funny, I'd forgotten that. And of course, yeah, like that's no, I think that's what an incredible piece of storytelling or metaphor from Tolkien,
It really was, yeah.
because I think that's precisely how it is. Certainly my guru used to talk about that. She
Hmm.
talked about the danger of as you ascended in consciousness. She said the ego grows in equal measure. And you have to, well, not that the ego grows, but there's always that element there. There's always that potentiality for the ego to sort of usurp all of that progress and take over.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I think in Christian, term in Christian tradition, it's considered that the devil was like the highest angel, but he got too big for his britches, and so because he was so high, he crashed all the way down. So the moral of the story, I think, is um, the higher we. What was that line from the Beatles song? The higher we fly, the everyone's got something to hide from, except for me and my monkey. It's from that song.
Yes, yeah.
Uh,
The higher you fly, the lower you go. No.
something. In any case, the more
Oh,
careful you need to be, and
yeah.
the more you need to counterbalance whatever it is you're experiencing with simplicity and humility, harking back to a point we made an hour ago.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's that word humility, that's I think the first, well, maybe not the first time we mentioned it, but I wanted to say that is something that I meditate on that word a lot and that concept a lot, um, um, particularly for myself. I'm going to
Yeah.
say because in this lifetime, I've been again blessed with being a good physical body and mind and stuff. So during my lifetime, I've actually been awarded all kinds of accolades for my academics and for even athletics at one time and different things, and all of these things that have the potential to feed the ego, right? And certainly have fed my ego at times. But so just bearing that in mind and always being aware that whatever comes to me, to again, in the words of my guru, give it back to God.
Mm.
Whatever comes, whoops, I'm going to stop doing that. I'm so sorry. Um, but whatever comes to us is to recognize that if it's an authentic appreciation of something truly beautiful that has emanated or come forth from you, um, give that back to God because that's where it comes from, you know,
Mm.
and not to. And again, I want to emphasize, I don't say that with coming from some sort of a statement of dogma or quote unquote belief. It's something that I feel very, very deeply, and very much like Frodo in the Ring. It's in the moment that I give it back to God. Oh, there's actually like a weight that comes off my
Mm.
shoulders,
Yeah.
and it's a beautiful thing. And if I can sort of keep that going on a regular basis, I feel like that's reconditioning the nervous system, like we were talking about, but it's reconditioning the heart, our whole spiritual, all the various bodies, all the koshas,
Yeah.
you know.
Thy gifts, my Lord, I surrender to thee. It's from some Vedic scripture. I don't know which
Ah,
one. Um, yeah, you have to constantly give it back rather than appropriate it, or rather than take possession or ownership or authorship of it.
yeah.
Which reminds me of another nice phrase. You mentioned humility. I've heard humility defined as the quality of not insisting that things happen any particular way. And if you think about that, if you insist that things happen in a particular way, then your individuality is kind of, concretizing itself and trying to run the show. Whereas, and I'll couple this with another nice quote I heard, which is turn your desires into preferences. A desire is like, this has got to happen for me. A preference is like, if thy will, if thou wills it, Lord, then this would be nice. But hey, you run the show, so whatever.
Yes, and yeah, that infinite intelligence very much knows better than us most of the time
Yeah.
as to what we need. But yeah, that's part of humility for sure, and also I was going to say the not needing to be recognized. That's probably one of the hardest things for human beings is
Hmm.
we all want some sort of degree of affirmation. We all want some degree of recognition. We want it's some form of validation, you know. And when that's taken to sort of megalomaniacal measures, we know certain people in the world at present that are that's where they're really coming from, is this rabid need that's grown out of control, this need to be recognized, this need to be acknowledged. Now, that's one extreme, of course. But traveling in China, I met all sorts of people that were just absolutely of the most humble, sincerely humble manner. And also Latin America. I've traveled a lot in Latin America. And
Yeah, your wife is Chilean, right?
that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And meeting those people and being with those people, including the Latin American community here where I live, it's been transformative for me. It's again another element of the big picture for me, um, and just it's something that inspires me to emulate as much as possible. So
Yeah. There's a point you brought up a couple times in your notes about an essential experience of deep shame or anguish as the false self is recognized. Do you feel like, and it's also an essential part of our growth, something we must pass through in order to come to full realization of our true being, which is pure joy. So do you feel like everyone has this intrinsic core wound of shame or anguish that they carry around with them, and it's some kind of a threshold that they have to pass through in order to arrive at one's true nature?
I don't think that people are carrying it around with them all the time, or at least not all people. Some people are, some people by virtue of their childhood upbringing, God knows, they've been through all sorts of trauma. They carry all kinds of unfounded shame and whatnot. And I realized after I wrote that note that maybe shame isn't the best word. Maybe the word I'm looking for is grief or grieving. It's something, if there was an intersection between those two words of shame and grief. And what I was getting at, and what I've experienced, or I think I've experienced, is this notion that as you awaken, um, there's a moment where you're not there, you're not fully ascended, as it were, and you suddenly get this full vision of yourself, your humanness, and where you've been. And it's kind of like that wincing Homer Simpson kind of, don't, like this, but in the deepest, deepest, deepest sense. And I think this in the Bible is represented by the story of the prodigal son. The prodigal son is the son who leaves home and goes away and does all kinds, gets drunk and carouses and does terrible things. And then, but he eventually comes back, and the father loves him just as much as the other son, who was the good boy all the while. And of course, the good boy is really upset. Like, hold on a second, that he's a jerk. He's been misbehaving all this time. How can you possibly love him as much as me? And the beauty of that story is that no, like we are never, of course, we are never separate from God, that source, that spirit. We're never that is just our true identity. But living in this illusion, of course, in separateness, yada yada. I think it's just part of that transition. It's part of that. That's what I was reaching for, and when I wrote that note, and I think I still stand by that. Maybe there's something in my comprehension that's still lacking, but I think it's also represented in the story of Christ on the cross, and when he cries out, "Father, why hast thou forsaken me?" There's this moment of doubt, like, oh God, like maybe I'm really not worthy. you know Maybe I'm really not the person I thought I was, or the being, this being that I thought I was. There's a moment, and it's very, at least for me, was very, very acute, very, very painful. And it's a deep sense of, like I say, it's not exactly shame. It's a deep sense of grief, and that I experienced, anyways. But then coming through that, um, it's sort of like it's all good now.
Yeah.
This feeling, this glorious feeling that as much as I am not perfect in my humanhood, I know where my true source lies, and I will continue to endeavor to live with the utmost integrity, and I will become a follower of your website.
Of my website?
The integrity
Oh,
website.
yeah, the ASI website, right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I like to laugh, as you can see. I did, but now where's I going with that? But yeah, that's what I was reaching for when I
Yeah.
made that note.
I mean, one theme that's gone throughout our conversation is that it popped up at various times, is that in your reincarnation story, when you had that therapy, and in what you just said, and a few other times, is that whatever its qualities, there is some kind of, as Samuel Bonder likes to call it, core wound, or Eckhart Tolle, the pain body, or you know, Upanishad says certainly all fear is born of duality. So that like there's some kind of core fear at the very junction point of our universal and individual natures, but there's some gunk down there. And the theme that we've come back to several times is that one way or another we can't bypass it, because if we skip around it and think we've landed in Shangri-La, it's going to rear its ugly head again and cause problems in our behavior. Somehow we have to transcend it, and yet purify and neutralize it in the course of our spiritual progress.
Yeah, yeah. No, I wholly agree. Yeah.
Yeah. Hmm. And you can elaborate, but that was my attempt to summarize that theme that's come up several times here.
Oh, I wish I could elaborate, but again, I thought you expressed it so well.
Okay. Um, so you still have a full-time job, or are you retired?
I still have a full-time job. Yeah.
What do you do?
I work in communications. So
Oh,
I was
okay.
in the private sector for 25 years, and
Yeah.
then 2 years ago, I took a job with our provincial government.
Okay. Uh,
Actually, sorry,
no, go ahead.
I have a good story to share
Sure.
around how that happened. Oh gosh, I don't know if I want to get into the details. It was precisely. I'll again. Uh, I'm going to overpromise here and underdeliver with my storytelling on this occasion. But anyways, it was on during that period when I was laying on the floor with my back in pain for 10 days, and I was still working in the private sector, and I something clicked with me mentally, and I realized I needed to leave my job and make a transition.
Mm.
And I was talking with a good friend of mine. It was in San Francisco, and as this emerged, and I'm not joking. And by the way, this is germane to my brother, my dear brother, who introduced me to our guru. He's a chiropractor now,
Right.
and he does all kinds of this sort of energy work and whatnot. Anyways, here's what happened. In the moment that I had the realization, the real clear understanding that I need to quit this job and move on, my back went click, and the pain disappeared.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Yeah, and uh, and then here's the next thing that happened, and this is an exercise in faith and trust in the universe. Made myself a cup of coffee. I wandered out into the garden, and I sat and I sort of stared up at the sky and the clouds, and then I thought, well, what's going to happen now? and uh, and I thought, oh gosh, I don't know. I don't have really any irons in the fire at this moment. Let's see what happens. But I got to trust. And so I'd sent. Oh, by the way, the key here is I just sent the email to my old employer saying that it's been wonderful, but here's my 2 weeks notice, right? And so I go out and make my coffee. What happens now? And I wander back into the house finally, an hour later, no, an hour and a half maybe, at most, max. And I check my email, and it was from our this job that I had applied to 18 months prior,
Hmm.
and it said, "Hi, Jim. I don't know if you remember, but you applied for this job, and we interviewed you, and you were the second candidate at the time. But this other candidate's gone now; they've moved on, and we'd like to hire you. Are you
Ah,
interested in the job?" So, and I said, "Yeah, I am," because it was is actually a job that I was very interested in,
hmm.
and that's where I am today. And it's funny because every day that I go into the office, I'm just pleased as punch. Like, I'm just so happy. I'm just in my happy place. And but part of the lesson in that story too was the fact that my back was out for 10 days, and actually the fact that my back was out in the first place was emblematic of the resistance I had put up against leaving my old work, right?
Hmm.
Because I had actually had strong inklings prior to that, but I was sort of resisting that out of fear, right? And
Yeah.
so there you go.
That's really interesting. I mean, I get a lot of synchronicities like that myself. So far, they haven't had to involve severe back pain or something, but just things like having some thought and then having some amazing coincidence happen, to fulfill that thought. But it's funny. I mean, is this? It's nice that you enjoy your job now, and I don't know how you felt about your old job. Maybe it was like, I don't. I'm tired of going
I
into this office.
I loved my old work for a
Yeah,
very long period of time. There was, a good 10 years there or
yeah,
whatever. But what had happened is I just gotten to the point where my soul, knew that it was time to move on.
yeah.
And, but, and then, again, a key point in all of this is I was resisting. Why was I resisting? And for me, it's pretty clear that was my Protestant upbringing.
Uh-huh.
And maybe it goes all the way back to Lars the Norwegian as well. I think I've had many, many generations of I've always had this attitude of you never quit a job, right?
Yeah.
Unless you've got another job already, like you've somewhere else. But the idea of quitting a job, like you just don't do that. Like
Uh,
that's just not done. And so I feel like this was the universe sort of laying it out for me. It's like, Jim, it's time for you to really learn some real trust. Like, that Protestant work ethic is really nice, and it's for the most part, it's a good thing for the most part. However, when it gets to the degree that it blocks your awareness that God is taking care of you, the universe is taking care of you, I think it's time for us to show you, to set you straight on this. And this was done to me in I feel like in a very compelling manner. So
yeah, it's interesting that you had to go through 10 days of agony to get the message. Maybe next time you'll just get it and you won't have to go through that. I mean, I was
yeah.
wondering, like, what was so cosmic about this new job that he had to go through all that suffering to get the, to make up his mind to shift to the new thing. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe there's not that dramatic a difference between your old job and your new, but it was just the principle of learning to kind of go with the flow a little bit more and not impose your own will on it, on the
That
thing.
that was yeah, that was certainly a huge part of it. Not, go with the flow, go as you're directed.
Yeah.
Listen to
Yeah.
you're being directed. Pay attention, listen, and trust, faith. What value is all this? All your talk about faith and spirit if you don't actually practice it. But I will say this: it was also the case that I'd sort of gone as far as I could go in terms of my what I had to offer in that old employment,
Mm.
and in terms of those relationships, which continue to this day. It's wonderful, and it's great, but it's kind of like it had just simply run its course. And where I am now, I really feel like, again, on the surface level, I do my work, and I'm very proud of the work I do, and I like what I do on a daily basis. But it's the relationships, and actually, this is a big theme for me that we haven't touched on today. Um, for me, one of the most glorious things in this life is relationships, and
Hmm.
for me, of course, it's a truism that as mammals and humans, we are social creatures, but it is a deeply spiritual experience. Like our relationships are how we grow and how we help others to grow. And I'm just in my new place of employment. Um, I have all these relationships that I just really value, just what I consider beautiful, relationships with interesting people where I feel I'm able to see the infinite in each indwelling in each individual, and yeah, and hopefully there'll
Yeah,
be something of that in me.
that's interesting. And of course, you never know what might yet come of the fact that you were in that circumstance rather than the other. Um, have you ever seen
Yeah.
that movie with Gwyneth Paltrow called Sliding Doors?
Yes.
Yeah, it's kind of cool. Like, just totally different trajectories of her life depending on whether she managed to get on the subway or not, um, on a particular occasion. But you never know what might happen once you. There's a quote from a British mountaineer. I forget the guy's name, but it was sometimes attributed to Goethe. But the quote is about how once we begin to take action or initiative, all kinds of events and circumstances and synchronicities and things happen to support us, which wouldn't happen if we just didn't take that first step. In other words, you have to sort of move, and then the train is moving. Everybody jumps on the train and comes to your assistance. I'm totally slaughtering the quote, but you know that one I'm talking about.
Yeah. No, and that's always been one of my favorite quotes. And here I thought it was Goethe, but it's not Goethe.
Everybody always attributes to him, but it's actually another guy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very good. Very good.
All right.
No, that's like,
Yeah.
but I've certainly seen that in my life, and I've often quoted that to my children.
Yeah.
In encouraging them to pursue their innermost direction. And that's something that is so important to me as a father. Is like, if there's one thing that I would like to be able to get right in raising my children, I would like to know that I've helped to instill that knowledge and that practice in their habits, and that confidence in themselves, and well, ultimately their desire to establish that contact with their innermost guidance, and then to thereafter have the courage to follow it.
Yeah. Good. Well, that's a good ending point. Okay. I was waiting for you to say something really gemmy that we can end on. So, you do have a website. What do you offer on your website? Is it just your book, or do you have some kind of sessions with people or anything like that?
No, at this point, no. I've been too busy with working and other things going on. I'll probably start doing a blog.
Yeah.
Probably add a blog there. At present, it's really just promoting the book. Um, but yeah, we'll see where it goes. I'm waiting to see what emerges.
Yeah.
So
Good.
yeah.
Well, as I said, it's an enjoyable book. I think it's a nice little autobiography. um, Took me about 5 hours and something to listen to it. I always convert things to audiobooks, but it's not a big long read. But I think people will enjoy it. And I found there were a lot of just little things you went through that I found edifying, and educational for myself. Just they made me reflect in certain ways that I found useful.
Yeah, well, I'm so glad to hear that. And it's interesting to hear the reader response that I've had from different people, and um, people of all different ages
Hmm.
will draw something different from it, which is what I would have hoped for, frankly. I think there's a lot of different lessons and opportunities in that, um, and it's just appealing. It's pleasing to me that the people are taking value from it. But first and foremost, what my motivation was to write a story that would demonstrate principles rather than elucidate on concepts.
Nice. That was good. And you did a good job of it. Okay. Well, thanks, Jim. I really enjoyed getting to know you and having this conversation.
Well,
And
likewise.
thanks to those who've been listening or watching. My next interview is going to be with Diane Hennessy Powell, whose name you will recognize if you have listened to the telepathy tapes, and which briefly became the most popular podcast in the world, and is still, I'm sure, quite popular. It's about autistic children who can't speak, but they use a letterboard to communicate, but who, for whatever reason, and the whole podcast explores this, are uncannily psychic, telepathic. And fascinating podcast. Anybody who listens to it gets really drawn into it. And Diane Hennessy Powell is the chief scientist in the project, and has been studying these kids. So we're going to talk about that. And it goes way beyond sort of autistic kids who can't speak, who are telepathic. I mean, there are all these implications as the podcast unfolds about, what's going on in the world in terms of its spiritual awakening, and what role these kids are playing, and so on, and what humanity might end up like eventually once we go through all of our transitions. So stay tuned for that. That's the next one. All right. Thanks, Jim.
Oh, thanks, Rick. Thank you.
Yeah.
Um, I'd like to. Sometime it'd be a pleasure to talk.